Black folks, white folks, Hispanics, and Asians all agree in vast majorities that school choice, the day has come. Why? Probably because of the pandemic. We started figuring out what they were not teaching in schools, what they were teaching in schools, and how bad the results have been, the precipitous drop in scores, the worst in the history of the country.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. You know, for over a year, we have been doing these weekly episodes, policymakers, elected officials, really brilliant people. And it's fairly customary for me to start and say you're in for a treat, and I'll always mean that. That is definitely true this week because our guest today, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, isn't just a member of the Senate, which itself would be impressive and be a treat. He's someone who is a leader, and not just of the conservative movement, but I would dare say this entire country. And most of all, he is a joy-filled fellow American, and this is going to be a joy-filled episode. Senator Tim Scott, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. What a blessing. Congratulations on your continued rise and your leadership. Thank God for a positive, optimistic person at the top of the helm of one of the most important organizations in all of conservatism in the country.
You're kind to say that. It's a privilege. I say that a lot. It's heartfelt. When I walked in the doors here at Heritage a little over a year ago now, I told all of my colleagues at the time, you are my people. We're going to work together. And what I was excited about is the cheerfulness of this place. And it's been that way for 50 years. And it's actually a really good place to start. And that is not about heritage, but on cheerfulness and better put, joy.
Yes.
And you and I were talking a little off camera about the importance of joy, which comes from the interior, really from faith, from above. You're someone that if just a casual observer on the street were to read your biography as a young man, not knowing the success you would have in business and then being in politics, they would say, how in the wide world of sports is Tim Scott joyful? Tell us about that.
Well, thank you. I had the great privilege of being raised by a mom who was joy-filled as well. And our spiritual heritage, if you read the book of Timothy, 2 Timothy talks about Lois and Eunice, or Eunice and Lois is his spiritual heritage. In the same way, this Timothy comes from the same vantage point.
Appropriate.
Louisa and Francis is my spiritual heritage. So when you grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, there are lots of reasons not to be filled with joy if you misunderstand the definition of joy. Circumstances around you may make it less likely that you'll be happy or have fun, but the truth is joy comes, as you said, from the inside. For me, joy starts with my relationship with the Lord. Without that, I don't know how you have joy, but with it, I'm not sure how you don't have it. Part of what we have to strive to do every day, and I woke up this morning with that concept that I have a responsibility to be joy-filled, but also let my face know it too. And so it's really important for me to remind myself, even though some things are challenging, this current administration makes me pull all my hair out. I had an afro at the beginning of it. Now I'm down to this. So literally the joy that I look for sometimes, I have to remember that it comes from the inside, not from the outside. But if you do that, I think you lead in a different direction. I think you not only lead in a conservative direction as conservatives, but you lead in a direction where the desire of my heart is to model the behavior that comes from Scripture. Because ultimately, it's not about presidents, it's about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
Thank you for that. I know the entire audience, wherever they are on their own respective spiritual journeys, will appreciate that coming from you because you've now been recognized as a national leader, as a member of the United States Senate long enough that people know your authenticity.
Yes.
And I think people, when they, maybe tune into this episode, they're expecting us to talk a lot about policy.
Yes.
And we're kind of not going to do that. We'll talk about some. If that's
Absolutely.
okay with you.
Absolutely.
We'll certainly talk about education.
Yes,
and
please.
The conversation will go where the conversation goes. But all of that to say, before we even gear up to talk about that important issue of education, I'm curious about the inflection points in your life. I mean, we all have them. I mean,
absolutely.
And so clearly you can think in hindsight about 2 or 3 that stand out as real inflection points in a positive way for where you've ended up.
Well, one is, it starts off, I've often said that I was blessed with a miserable beginning. And I really mean that. I mean, sometimes I think the good Lord has been able to take the mess that was my life to give me a message out of that mess for other people that makes me a messenger for the times in which we live. And so one of those inflection points for me was a 7-year-old Timmy. I was sitting there on the side of the couch. My dad was in the Air Force at the time. We were stationed in Kinchlow, Michigan. or Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, Kinchel Air Force Base. And my parents had decided to divorce. My dad was just a tough cookie at the time. And I remember sitting on the side of that couch praying and asking God to keep my family together. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty of those circumstances, I was thinking about giving up Christmas, birthdays, looking for something I could do because I was sure it was my fault.
It's a very natural response.
Yeah. I found that out over time, but it was such a miserable, heartbreaking experience that it weighed on me for years. But it was moving into my grandparents' house where we had no resources, 700 square foot house, rented house, very porous. But my grandfather, who believed in hard work, believed that life can make you bitter or you can make life make you better. He had decided to make it better. And he almost infected me within days of coming into the house with this notion that hard work will pay off, but not immediately. My grandmother, being the spiritual woman in the house, she was the kind that prayed so loud. You were just like when your friends came over, like, shh, grandmama, shh, can you go out in the backyard and do that, right? She was this praying woman who believed that there is always reasons to be filled with hope. And she was optimistic, she was positive, and she's the lady that walked a mile or two to work to clean houses, 8 hours, come home, clean our house, and cook food, and then take care of the family. But yet she was always, always, always happy. And so when you walk out of a miserable circumstance into a house without resources, but the one thing you want more than everything else you have in abundance, which is love, you find that you just won the lottery. And people would look back and say, really, the lottery? The lottery. Having love as the primary source, the primary currency in the household was such a blessing. And I think it set me up for success that my grandfather taught me hard work, my grandmother taught me to pray, and my mother really embodied both of those through life. So most important miserable experience of my life was my parents' divorce that has allowed me to be sensitive to people going through hard times and challenges, whether it's divorce, whether it's poverty, whether it's physical handicaps or physical injuries. All that's been very helpful for me. The second one was when I had a car accident as a 16-year-old senior in high school, working towards lots of football scholarships, averaging about 7 yards a carry my junior year. I was impressive. Wasn't bad. 200-pound running back at 4.5, 40-yard speed was a cool thing in the world of the early 80s. And I fell asleep driving my car down the interstate at 7 a.m. in the morning, taking my mother to work. I went through the windshield, came back in the car, rolled it through 2 lanes of eastbound traffic, through the median, in the air, through 2 lanes of westbound traffic. Ended up alive, broke my ankle, shattered the windshield with my back, lots of scars, missed the next 6.5 weeks, almost 7 weeks of football, my senior year, and lost most scholarships, ended up with a small scholarship to Presbyterian College, which was a miserable experience because Presbyterian College was an academic school, not an athletic school. So it was really unfortunate for me.
Not what you were looking for.
Not at all. I mean, thank God for the athletics because it got me in. But I also, in September of that freshman year, became a Christian. September 22nd, 1983, gave my heart back to the Lord. And I will tell you, another miserable experience became the ultimate experience of joy. And so those 2 points of inflection really frames what I try to do in public service. The final one, if I haven't taken too much time.
Not at all. That's why we do a long form podcast.
All right.
We love stories. As fellow Southerners, Senator,
yes.
we do this all afternoon.
Unfortunately, you're right, because I can do this all day.
We won't do that to you.
Well, not for the audience. I would love this, actually. Last one is 15 years old, nearly failed out of high school as a freshman. All that life had accumulated in a negative way. But I met this guy named John Moniz, who was a Chick-fil-A operator. And Chick-fil-A has a wonderful culture in their business. And he wanted to mentor me, not because there was a program, because he saw potential in me that I did not see in myself. And he started teaching me some very valuable lessons. John was a Christian, a small business owner, and someone who was motivated and inspired. And so he gave me all the Zig Ziglar tapes I could listen to. It was just fantastic. He died, unfortunately, right around his 38th birthday. I was 19 at the time. His mission statement was to positively impact the lives of 1 million people. And because I felt like the 4 years I spent with him became my first 4 new years of thinking, the new me emerged because of John Moniz, that I would spend the rest of my life in part paying it back to him and paying it forward. And so I set my mission statement to positively impact the lives of 1 billion people with a message of hope and opportunity, hoping my faith in Christ Jesus and opportunity, the lessons of financial literacy and financial independence taught to me by John Moniz. So those 3 inflection points really have framed my entire time in public service and frankly led me into public service.
What a beautiful story of John Moniz and influencing you. And I guess just kind of thinking about the timeline quickly set you up in a position where in September of 1983, you could receive the Lord's truth, right?
It all worked together. It's the Romans 8:28 effect, right? So it all comes together for good. And I'll say that whether you believe or whether you don't believe, the truth of the matter is we talked earlier as well about natural law and universal principles that they work whether you believe in them or not. Gravity is one of them, right? And so the truth is that if we can just embrace those universal principles, we find ourselves leading the country in a right direction. And the best way to lead is to serve. And that's one of the things I love about your service here at Heritage is that you have made the decision to serve. One of the things I love about the founding of a Catholic school, a charter school, it's a desire to serve. What our nation is desperate for, starved for, is hope. But not hope is the empty hope, but hope that is the combination between inspiration plus perspiration manifest in hopefulness for communities.
We do need a lot more of that, don't we?
I do. Yeah, we do.
So you and I knew coming into this, we were going to talk about education.
Absolutely.
There's sort of a 0% chance that you could have Senator Tim Scott and me, given my background and most importantly yours, and not talk about education. So let's maybe start, if we may, with kind of the social, cultural diagnosis of education.
Yes. And
then maybe get into some policy prescriptions.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I'd say from the diagnosis is that all monopolies are bad.
It's a good place to start.
And K through 12 is a monopoly. And the results prove that monopolies are bad. It's very expensive, and the performance is very low. So one of the things I think about from an apolitical perspective is the state of monopolies around the world and around the country and around education. So the question is, how do you change it? Good news, the answer is really simple. Find competition for the monopoly. And by having competition in the monopoly, the price comes down, but the scores go up. And we've seen that. Charter schools is really a classic example of where that is true, because in South Carolina, and I'm sure throughout the country, that the average charter school gets 50 cents on the dollar at best. They struggle to find places to house their schools. There's no or little cooperation with the other public schools. So we can see just with a little competition, things get better for the students. The last point I'd make on this philosophical thought about education is education and are the systems designed for adults or for children? I think too often the concerns we have about public education is because they're designed for adults and they're protected by big labor unions that insulate adults as opposed to focusing on kids in classrooms and the future of those children and the future of the country that they'll live in. So if we could get the monopoly right and the focus right, we would get better results for the future. And that leads to a more political conversation. But the good news is that in this political conversation, 68% of Democrats, 67% of independents, and over 70% of Republicans all agree that the foundation of the conversation must include some form of school choice. Better news is Black folks, white folks, Hispanics, and Asians all agree in vast majorities that school choice, the day has come. Why? Probably because of the pandemic. We started figuring out what they were not teaching in schools, what they were teaching in schools, and how bad the results have been, the precipitous drop in scores, the worst in the history of the country. in part exposed because of the pandemic?
There are so many follow-up questions, but the way I like to talk about education, and this is, I think, sort of your calling card as a policy and political leader, is to put a human face on it.
Yes.
And because you mentioned the school that I started, John Paul the Great Academy in Louisiana, the many years that I was there, and I'm still helpful, I hope, as a donor. The story that has stuck with me is about halfway through our first year of participating in Louisiana's voucher program. One of our new parents came up. She had 7th or 8th grade young man there, African-American family. And she said, "Dr. Roberts, I need to speak to you." And I was thinking, oh man, what have we done unintentionally?
Yes.
And she had tears in her eyes. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we've done
Really
something
bad.
wrong. Yeah. I mean, you've probably been in conversations like that. And I said, what's wrong? She said, oh, there's nothing wrong.
Yes.
She said, "I want to thank you and everyone at this school for changing my son's life." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The joy of a school that's focused on kids rather than a bureaucracy,
Wow.
rather than a system."
Yes.
And then this continued, and by this point, I've got tears in my eyes too. And she said, "But I also have to tell you, you've changed the trajectory of our family and every family at this school forever."
Absolutely. Yes.
Now, I'm going to credit the Holy Spirit for that.
Amen.
This is the point of the story.
Good word.
But to me, taking that anecdote and applying that to policy, if we can scale that young mother's optimism,
Yes.
her recognition that this is what we have to do, and we ought to be able to do this in public schools,
Oh
right?
my gosh. So I mean, what you just said, Kevin, so important. And I wish I could find all the words in the right frame to see it through. But think about what you just talked about. Number one, it's apolitical.
Exactly.
Every mother I know loves her kids more than she loves herself. Every mother I know wants a really good education for their child. Why? Because they believe that with a good education and the marvel of America, their future will be better than their own, that their kids' future will be better than their own. So what you talked about was that foundation that was formed, a strong foundation of education. From a public policy perspective, we can't do as much about faith as perhaps some would want to, but the truth is we can do a lot about education. But imagine a school that teaches kids the ABCs versus CRT, right? Imagine a place where you also learn about financial literacy. So you're getting educated. And a good economy makes all things possible. And in America, the closest thing to magic is a good education. So you have a good economy and a good education. What is the future prospects for every child in every zip code in America? Good. So what does that make the prospect for America? Great. How hard is it to see? Easy. Unfortunately, easy and simple may lead in different directions.
Have you discovered that in your experience in the Senate?
Unfortunately, I have, especially from a legislative perspective.
It's just hard, right?
It really is, because one of the things, I believe in federalism. So I don't want the federal government running local education. But I do want us to encourage competition and the 50 laboratories of democracy. Go to work. Go to work. And if we can, through some tax credit on your federal taxes, help local schools local jurisdictions who already have programs to have more resources come into those jurisdictions, I think that's a good thing, number one. Number two, if we're going to spend $70 billion, which is only 10% of the overall spending in K through 12 education, well, Title I, Title II, Title I has to do with poor kids, Title II, special needs kids. Why not give the parents more flexibility on how they use their dollars? I think that's such an important part of the apparatus, but it also continues to support the approach that education is a local and state issue. We can make it better.
We can, and I mean, where Heritage stands on the
Yes.
future of the Department of Education. Over the next 6 years, we want to see it wound down and cease to exist. And we don't impute motives there. I mean, that's actually, I think, one of the things that makes us effective, and it's one of your calling cards too, that you can ascribe the best of intentions to an idea that 40 years later is not working, right? Yeah. And so all of that to say, to step into the weeds for like half a minute, we don't want to enlarge the Department of Education, even with anything that's school choice. But there's an easy solution.
Yes.
To your point.
Yes.
Just move it to the Department of the Treasury, right?
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Well, and, one of the things I say, even with I created something called Opportunity Zones, which has some it's been very successful. But one of the things that we did not do is create any new federal bureaucrats.
Exactly.
It was just a tax credit. The money stayed in the community, stayed with the investor to invest where they were. There was not a single new entity created because of the legislation, just more resources coming to the overall system. There's a way to do it right. There's a way to do it wrong.
That's right. And I wanted to hang on that so you talk about the opportunity zones, because I thought the legislative approach to that was elegant, actually. I mean, it was simple and elegant because it addressed the problem without enlarging the bureaucracy.
Because that's part of the challenge of, I'm a big believer that if we are going to get it right philosophically and then from a principle perspective while applying the principles, what we say we have to do. And if we believe that the country is better with a smaller and less intrusive government, let us not grow a bigger and more intrusive government. Once again, it's kind of a simple concept, harder to do in the world where the appetite for spending is insatiable. So we have to make sure that we carve out conservatism in such a way that we carve in common sense.
Yeah.
So when we are there, common sense is present. When we leave, common sense seems to leave as well. We can see that from the $4 trillion spent by the Biden administration after COVID had been solved. It was in the rearview mirror. What happens when you spend $4 trillion? Well, first you have to print $4 trillion. And that leads to the highest inflation we've seen in a long time. In the end, the solutions comes back to things like opportunity zones from my perspective, which is an incentive-based economy. If we create the right incentives in our economy, we'll get the right results. I'm a big believer in the Laffer curve, that the lower the taxes, the more production you receive. In 2018 and 2019, we saw both happen. We saw that with lower taxes, revenue to the Treasury went up. Not only that, which is a secondary effect, the primary effect is we said about $4,000 will hit the average household. It was $4,400. Good news for us, right? Thank God. But the truth is that we also cut the taxes of a single mother by 70%, dual income household by 60%. Why? Because I believe you're better at spending your money than we are. Period. These philosophical dispositions, anchored and centered in principle and then applied, led to the greatest economy we've seen in our lifetime. And if we would just practice what we preach, not just from faith, but as conservatives, I think the results will attract more people to the audience. And to your original point, that with your school, when that mother walks in with her child, tears streaming down her cheeks, she doesn't care whether you're Republican or Democrat.
She couldn't have cared less.
White or black. Because she loves, the favorite name in my community is Boo. She loves Boo more than anybody else. It's just the way it works. It's just the way it works. And if we carpe diem, we seize upon that every day, the conservative movement it'll explode.
I agree with that enthusiastically. I've lived it out. Are there other issues right behind education where maybe they're low-hanging fruit, that we take that same approach, not just from a policy point of view, but kind of a rhetorical point of view, in a very authentic human way, that as conservatives, whether in elective office or over here at Heritage, we really need to be homing in on as a way of broadening the movement?
If it were up to me, I'm
giving you the magic wand.
I got 4 for you.
Okay.
One is patriotism. I've been talking about it for the last 2 months. I think it's really important. One of the things I've said in several speeches back in February, is that my grandfather, who was born in 1921, who grew up in the Jim Crow South and knew a very different South Carolina and a very different America. But he believed then what some doubt now. He believed in the goodness of America and what our country could be. He believed that our founding fathers got it right in what they wrote. Now, obviously, they had to amend it to include people like me, so I'm not pretending to whitewash anything. But the fact of the matter is that when you found a nation upon Judeo-Christian ethos, the foundation is based on objective truth. Upon that foundation, sooner or later, the flawed individuals that we are always have a higher ideal, hence a more perfect union. You strive to be better, and the better we get, the more inclusive we are. My grandfather believed that in the 1930s in Jim Crow South.
The depths of this, right?
Absolutely, and that's why when I walked into his house at 7 years old, and he had every right to be bitter, but he chose to be better. and forced us to believe too. That is where we make a lot of ground. Because in my opinion, patriotism is embedded with faith. Because it was the assumption that there was a creator who bestowed upon us unalienable rights. Second thing I'd say, of course, is education. The third thing I would say is economics. Every time I speak in an inner city school about taxation, about the economy, they all come to the same conclusion. There's no competition, unfortunately, in most of the schools I go to. When I talk about the tax code, and I say, how much is too much in taxes? They say the rich don't pay enough in taxes. I'm like, okay, cool. If I make $22 out of the 100, how much should my taxes be? Don't give them the answer. They think it should be around $22. When I say it's $40+, they all say that's too much. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? It's too much. When I say if we take the minimum wage from where it is up by $1, I say, can you count to 5 of your friends? Pick the one you want me to fire. Because when the wages go up artificially, the number of people working comes down. No one ever told them that there is a consequence to the decisions that we make. When I tell them that only 2% of single mothers make the minimum wage, that 2/3 of the folks making the minimum wage live in a middle income household, they're like, no one told us. So taking our conservatism on the road is incredibly helpful. So economics, and then finally, the issue of security. I think we would win a lot of converts if we spoke passionately about the issue of crime, because frankly, crime is an intra-racial problem. So when you see 3,000 people being shot in Chicago and 700 or so deaths, it's all the criminal and the victim are of the same race. So if you want to have a conversation about crime, why do we never talk about the victim of crime? I think this is an easy, low-hanging fruit if we talked about it properly. The folks who led against the Minneapolis City Council defunding the police were African Americans, who, by the way, 81% want the same level of policing or more. We just need to make sure that we connect the dots. I think the border and fentanyl, that's another issue that actually gets everyone on the same page.
These are 80-20 issues, right?
Exactly.
And what's amazing about them is, pardon the interjection, is the seriousness of these.
Yes.
Whether it's public safety in Chicago or Austin or San Francisco.
Or Charleston, yes.
Washington, where you and I are sitting now. And I would say especially Washington, because every American ought to feel some humiliation about the human tragedy here, right?
Absolutely.
But all of that to say, these are 80-20 issues on tough issues.
Right.
And therefore, just from a purely political point of view, not even getting into the policy, like political messaging,
Absolutely.
This ought to be easy.
Exactly my point. Because the truth of the matter is, I can't think of a better time to be a conservative if we're willing to market. I can't think of a better time to lead than in the midst of a crisis. We are in an economic crisis. We are in a crisis of truth. I'm trying to look for the politically correct word for I can't stand. I can't stand when people say, oh, it's just my truth. I didn't know you get one. I don't get one either, right? You have an experience, but not a truth. There's objective truth. So when we have people coming together based on the truth of what we're talking about, Katie, bar the door. There will be no competition left. But we have to be there. So we have to go where we're not invited to be a part of that conversation. But you gave me too much time, and I apologize for taking too much of it up. But I do believe that we have simple solutions on our side of the aisle, philosophically, that would revolutionize how people think about politics. Now, we have a problem with mass media.
That is a real problem.
So we have a problem with disseminating the information in an objective fashion so that people know the truth. And they're not sold my truth as they are on, I won't even say I won't even say this channels.
Yeah, and yet, which is not at all
MSNBC. I just won't say it.
Just some letters. That
Exactly.
Where it seems as if we got the potential to overcome that, but it's not to dismiss the problem. I mean, you face this, we face it. It is for you and for us and many others. It is a daily problem.
Absolutely.
And yet, maybe because we're optimistic, we know at Heritage if we continue to persevere through that, but also be really innovative about the messages that we're using, about the tools at our disposal, but also not whining about the problem, but explaining why it's a real problem for Americans.
Exactly.
Not just for us at Heritage. I think that's really the key.
I think you hit the nail on the head. We need mature leadership.
That's right.
In a time of crisis. We need folks who are not focusing on each other, ourselves as leaders, but people who are focusing on the problem and who it affects the most. And that's never the leader. If you're called to lead, you're called to serve. And when you don't serve, you make it about you. That's always toxic.
In all of history.
Absolutely.
I'll ask you one final question,
yes, sir.
And then we'll let you get back to the people's business.
All right.
Across the street at the Senate. But you're welcome here.
Thank you very much.
We'll have you back many times.
I look forward to it.
It's a little bit of a gimme for you, but it's a heartfelt gimme, because I know as I travel the country as you do, I hear from a lot of people, young, middle-aged, older, that they're almost on the brink of despair. And I say almost because none of them are there yet.
Yes.
They know that despair is a sin, and they know that for Americans it is especially so.
Yes.
But they sense that we have lost something. How would you inject some optimism into that, while, as I know you would probably do, not being dismissive of a real heartfelt emotion?
Listen, if you look around and you try to judge success based on the focus of the government or mass media, you're probably going to feel despair. Because what we miss is the truth that people today have figured out how to monetize conflict and despair. It leads to depression and apathy. And so if we understand that, then we might want to look around our neighborhoods and see how well we get along. The way I look at it is a guy who grew up in the South, who understands racism and discrimination. I can't think of a more fair time than the ones in which we live. I can't think of a place that I can't go today that I could not have gone 10 or 15 years ago. Whether you want to be the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, whether you want to be an NFL quarterback, an NFL Super Bowl quarterback, you can do anything you want to be. The hardest thing to be today is an African-American conservative, not a CEO, not a star, but a conservative. Why? Because we have polluted the streams that somehow, some way, things are so bad that if you don't line up with folks who are on the other side, you just aren't blank enough. So here's hope. Hope is in the fact that there's not a greater story of evolution in the last 50 years than America. The fact is that in every demographic, in every area, all you can see is the trajectory of opportunity has never moved faster and further in a very small amount of time. You can measure that in income, in academic accomplishment. You can measure that in business. You can measure that in health. Literally in every major measurement, we are better off today than we were, except for one. There is the poisoning that comes from those who want to amass power at the expense of the people. Those folks will do whatever it takes to take money out of your pocket so that you can have a better life, to change the rules so that they win even at your expense. We do have to be very careful on that. But outside of that radical, progressive, left-wing folks, we find ourselves in the most prosperous time. And if we, as conservatives, start winning some elections, I think we'll be in the greatest times in American history, and they'll get better.
Working toward a more perfect union always, right?
Every day, all day.
Senator Tim Scott, thanks for who you are,
Thank you,
what
sir.
you represent, and for being here today.
Thank you for the invite.
You bet. God bless you.
You too.
Thanks for joining me. I told you it would be a riveting conversation, and it was. Thanks for making this show possible. We look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, take care. God bless America.